I think we will start our next panel. We're a little bit behind schedule, but everyone is ready.
He's American focus.
Stuart, sorry, we're going to start our next panel.
Okay.
Burge's stuff is interesting too. Brian Burge.
Our first speaker in this next panel is Reverend Dr. Peter Bush. Peter Bush is presently teaching elder at St. Andrew's Presbyterian Church, Fergus. He has served congregations in Ontario and Manitoba over the last 36 years. He has written extensively about the history of the PCC with special interest in mission, both home and overseas, and organizational change. In addition, he has written about ministry practice. Peter is married to Debbie Sutherland, from whom he received his Presbyterian pedigree. And I should also say, Peter is one of 4 past or present CSBH presidents who are involved in this year's conference.
I never was the president.
Oh, sorry. Oh, I thought you were.
I was convener of the Committee on History, but never the president.
Oh, sorry. Then I'm wrong. But also the author of the wonderful book Western Challenge, just a really fun book, a lot of great anecdotes. Please welcome Peter.
So I realized I looked at the schedule that you didn't have a title, so I'm stealing the title from the little pamphlet that was published at the time, the Gold So-Called Heresy Trial. I'm not sure that's what it's going to end up in papers, but that's what it follows. The appeal by 7 members of Knox's Church Galt against the decisions of the session, then of the presbytery, then of the synod, reached the floor of the General Assembly in 1889. The heresy trial, for that was what it was, took up the better part of 3 days of the General Assembly. It was a doctrine-heavy assembly in 1889, as the clause giving liberty of opinion on the marriage of widowers to their deceased wife's sister was brought to conclusion at that same General Assembly. So why look at this case? And especially why look at this case in the 150th anniversary of the PCC? First, that a matter internal to one congregation got to the floor of the assembly reminds us the denomination is made up of congregations. Congregations are the heart of the denomination. And that one congregation was able to gain that much attention from the General Assembly reminds us as historians of where the real life of the church lies. And I admit I sometimes forget that as I write. Second, as the narrative unfolds, it'll be evident that pastoral leadership is critical to the life of congregations. Among the things to be seen in this narrative is that attentive pastoral leadership, sensitive to diverse spiritualities within the life of a single congregation, can hold disparate elements together. Further, this narrative reminds us that events occurring decades earlier can impact even the present moment. Wise congregational leaders, is the subtext here, wise congregational leaders are historians and cultural interpreters of their congregations. And finally, this trial has intrigued me for more than 20 years. This is the first time I get to write about it. And really at the core, the question has always been, so how is it that this got to assembly in the first place? But our story actually does not begin in 1889. Our story begins back in 1868, 1869. In October 1868 through January of 1869, quote, a great upheaval was experienced in the churches of Galt, unquote. 2 Scottish preachers, Douglas Russell, Plymouth Brethren, and Charles Carroll, Baptist, arrived in Galt from Hamilton and began preaching in New Connection and Wesleyan Methodist chapels. But by November of 1868, those buildings were no longer able to accommodate the 1,000 people who were showing up each night to hear the preaching. So the meetings moved to Knox's Church Galt. The Presbyterian Home and Foreign Record stated, quote, this religious awakening, for that is what it is, has stirred people to consider more seriously and deeply than ever the great truths of religion, unquote. And historian Andrew Moerman writes, in the space of 3 months, Galt was burnt over. The Reverend James Kidd Smith had been at Knox's Galt since 1865 and had been called to serve a congregation between 400 and 500 members. Now, just over 3 years after being called, Smith opened the doors of Knox's to Russell and to Carroll, and Knox's grew dramatically. By March of 1871, there were over 800 members. That number is made even more impressive when it's recognized that 6 elders and 150 members had left Knox's Galt when he opened the doors to Russell and Carroll. Many of these new arrivals were converts who joined Knox's, and among them, as the star of our show, is J.A. Cranston. 3 things were seen as problematic with Russell and Carroll. They preached a message that the only confession needed to be a Christian was, I believe in Christ. Linked to this was the idea that salvation rested on the individual's belief. The believer was a participant in their own salvation, rather than that salvation resting entirely on God's grace. And third, Russell and Carroll were not ordained. So, interesting, right? Sorry. Interesting. The Reverend William Murdoch of Melville Presbyterian Church, Galt, with the support of other Presbyterian clergy in the community, brought charges against Smith that he was grievously guilty of allowing impure doctrine to be preached in a Presbyterian pulpit. Smith was exonerated by the presbytery, and by June of 1869, a new normal had been found with an enlarged Knox's Galt, another Presbyterian congregation in Galt, and a new Plymouth Brethren congregation also in town. In the fall of 1869, the new Knox's Galt was completed, and it could seat 1,350 people, and it was filled. Things continued with Smith leading Knox's, where half the congregation had come to faith under preaching that rested on the statement that all that was needed to be saved was, I believe in Christ. In the winter of 1871-1872, due to Mrs. Smith's ill health, the Smiths were in San Francisco. They returned to Galt in the spring, and Reverend Smith announced that he was resigning, and he took a call to the Fort Massey Mission in Halifax. 2 years later, after Mrs. Smith's health had improved, Reverend Smith was recalled to Knox's Galt in 1874. Now to the main event. All of that matters, okay? Now to the main event. In 1883, David Caldwell, for more than 30 years a member at Knox's, was, quote, led by a series of providences to investigate for himself as to the possibility of securing a more satisfactory Christian experience. After a variety of soul struggles, was unable to obtain his heart's desire concerning this thing. This is recognizably the language of second blessing, of instantaneous sanctification, fitting firmly within the holiness movement, and rather unusual within the Reformed tradition. Having made this spiritual breakthrough, Caldwell began to tell all that what he had experienced. His testimony, quote, awakened no little stir, unquote, and he was twice examined by the session as to whether his teaching was heresy. There was to be a third examination, but the matter was dropped before that third examination took place, and no formal charges were laid. Caldwell interpreted that matter being dropped as permission to continue speaking. Now, a sidelight here for a moment. A fire in 1989 at Knox's Galt means that the records which would help us to reconstruct what the session thought it had done are gone. So there's an evidentiary base that just doesn't exist for us. So back to our story. In 1885, Caldwell persuaded John D. Cranston, who had been converted in the 1868 revival, and some of Cranston's friends to attend a series of public services where instantaneous sanctification was the chief topic for consideration. Cranston also was dissatisfied with his spiritual life, and he wrote, quote, "I found daily that sin did have dominion over me, that the good I would that I did not do, and the evil I would not, I too often did. O wretched man that I am, who will deliver me from this death?" Unquote. Despite seeking counsel of various ministers and mature Christians, he found no one who could help him. So Cranston, quote, "settled down believing all Christians were alike, and that a better experience could be enjoyed here, but heaven would be my home after this mortal body was laid aside. So I lived in a half-dead state for 19 years, unquote. On Sunday afternoon, September 4th, 1887, Cranston, hearing that he had received the promised gift, the Comforter, the Spirit of God, as a person into his heart, and then he would be able to, quote, "to be more than a conqueror over the world, the flesh, and the devil," unquote. And in this moment brought a transformation in Cranston's life. As now he sought to restore broken relationships he had, became even more honest in his business dealings. Now, a sidelight here, I don't know if it's shown in the papers or not. So I know this through my wife's cousin, Angus, who is a collector of communion tokens. Cranston was the preeminent communion token maker in Ontario. Okay, holding on to this. In 1891, so this is after the trial's gone on and he's been thrown out. In 1891, Knox's Galt goes from communion tokens to communion cards. I have no evidence there's a connection, but it's just way too good, right? It's way too good. During this time that all of this is going on, the Reverend James Smith had served as moderator of the General Assembly from 86 to 87, received an honorary degree from Knox College, and his wife was again struggling with health issues. Because of her health, Smith announced in March of 1888 that he was accepting a call to a congregation in California. And this was precisely the time when the situation with the 7 revolters, as they became known, came to a head. So one of the unanswerable questions is, if Smith had not been as distracted, would he have been able to find a way forward through the creed versus experience debate of 1887, 1888, as he had been able to find a way through a similar kind of battle in 1868, 1869? What does appear evident is that his ability to hold open a wide door to create a space for a variety of views to coexist had been able to take place 20 years earlier. Given his distractions and impending departure, that meant that Knox's Galt was about to become a much tighter theological place. On April 18th, 1888, the session of Knox's Galt adopted a motion asking the 7 to appear before the session, which they did on the 26th of April. They did, and they had carefully read the standards of the Presbyterian Church, Book of Forms. The 7 noted that the citation for their presence was in fact out of order. Smith, who was in the chair at the time, agreed with the 7 and stated that the April 26th meeting could not be a legal trial. However, that did not prevent the session from coming to the conclusion that their holiness or sinless perfection views were disturbing the peace and harmony of this church, and if they did not live in harmony with the faith of this church on the doctrine of progressive sanctification, their names would be erased from the roll of the church, with the prayer that the Spirit of Christ may use this discipline of the church as a means of their restoration. At a meeting on the 14th of May, the session delivered the decision to the 7. The Reverend J.A.R. Dixon from a neighboring church was in the chair, because Reverend Smith was away. Dixon was far less accommodating to the seven than Smith had been, refusing to hear their objections to proceedings. And so the seven launched an appeal that was sent to the presbytery on May the 22nd, 1888. Life had become rocky at Knox's Gulch. The new minister, the Reverend Alexander Jackson, arrived in the late summer of 1888 from Southside Presbyterian Church in Pittsburgh. He had been called to come to Knox's Gulch, congregation in Canada, the largest Presbyterian congregation in Canada at the time, and the sixth largest Presbyterian congregation in North America. This is a prestige pulpit that's now got a war going on. Okay? But through the fall of 1888 and into 1889, whenever he preached about the doctrine of progressive sanctification or against holiness views, one of the seven who was sitting in the gallery would stand to either raise or contradict what he said during the sermon. We thought we had it tough. So, cutting through all the appeals and the decisions of the presbytery and the synod, the appeal reached the 1889 General Assembly. The trial began on June 17th, 1889, and over the better part of 3 days, the assembly heard the case, including a nearly 2-hour speech from John Cranston. Only 3 of the 7 were heard at the assembly of the 7, and that was by their own agreement. And one of the 3 who spoke was Mrs. A.K. Think about this. It's 1889. And a woman spoke on her own behalf in a trial at the General Assembly. But that's, sorry, there are so many remarkable little bits about this story, right? Not surprisingly, the General Assembly found for the synod, the presbytery, and the session against the seven. This little book. The Reverend Robert Knowles became minister at Knox's Gulch in 1898, so 10 years after the trial. His novel, St. Cuthbert's, this book, is widely recognized to be about Knox's Gulch. And there's a chapter in the book that describes the return to communion of a man who had been expelled from the celebration of communion. This is undoubtedly John Cranston, who chose to remain part of Knox's Gulch, even as after his appeal had been rejected by every level of the church. Thank you.
Thank you, Peter. Our next speaker is Dr. Sarah Moerman, and need to turn the screen on for the people here at Knox. Dr. Sarah Moerman is a research fellow in the Institute for Theology, Imagination, and the Arts in the School of Divinity at the University of St. Andrews, Scotland. Here, she lectures on and researches various connections between music, psychology, and theology. She is especially interested in the role that music, both liturgical and extra-liturgical, plays in one's faith and spiritual formation. Her PhD thesis was an investigation on the faith and theological drives of 3 contemporary composers and how theological belief plays a role in their compositional practices. She works collaboratively on several other research projects at the University of St. Andrews, one such being the project Sacred Landscapes of Fife, which she will speak about today. Thank you.
Hi, everyone from blustery Scotland. If someone can give me a thumbs up that you can hear me, that would help me out a lot. I'm going to take that as read. Great, thank you so much. I must warn you, it has just started to rain here in Scotland, which means that my internet connection is very unstable. So I'll do my best, but if I drop out, you'll know why. Thank you so much to Robert and especially to Ian Mason for the generous invitation to speak to you today. I am neither a historian nor a Presbyterian, but serendipitously, I became involved in a project here in Scotland that has some particular resonances, I think, with your society. I want to tell you a bit about the Sacred Landscapes project as a whole, but starting first with a brief overview of the broadly Christian as well as specifically Presbyterian history of the part of Scotland in which I live. Also, I will highlight the work of some of my colleagues, work that I think you will find interesting and perhaps helpful. The Sacred Landscapes of Fife project is housed at the University of St. Andrews, where I am based. It aims to present up-to-date research about the religious sites of coastal Fife. This project brings together and advises the academy, community, and government. In this project, we try to seek to achieve sustainable heritage outcomes by describing and preserving religious buildings of either historical or architectural significance. But where is coastal Fife? Let me show you. So, here is Scotland up here. Hopefully you can all see this somewhat well wherever you are sitting. Zoom in. This part of southeastern Scotland is Fife. Yes, it's raining. It's variable. We have Edinburgh down here. And roughly from this whole section around here is called the Kingdom of Fife. And the project that we're associated with is region here. So I'll zoom in just a little bit more. We have St. Andrews, again, Edinburgh is down here. From St. Andrews down to Edinburgh is an hour and a half drive. If you go right around the coast here, it doesn't look like much, but it's about 45 minutes. They're country roads. This is about a 17-mile drive, so not a huge area that we can see here. Of course, for Presbyterian historians, this is probably the most interesting bit. These are the sites where John Knox and Andrew Melville, of course, and a century later, Thomas Chalmers, who's from Anstruther right here, and
She's gone. Right. She's coming back on.
wow, so sorry. I'm back.
Given that it rains all the time, you mean interesting timing.
So maybe I just won't share a whole lot anymore. As you know, lies in its form of church governance. So the Scottish people, especially the were and are a fiercely independent people who were used to centuries of clan governance and resented the imposition of English monarchy. Not, I think, unlike the tensions between rural Ontarians and Toronto, maybe. This translated during the Reformation to an innate distrust of the authority of English bishops over the church. This predilection for localized, self-contained government is, I think, one of the drivers for the movement away from the hierarchies in Roman Catholicism or English Episcopalianism and toward the development of a system where leaders and elders are elected from within the church community. Thus, Presbyterianism really took root and gained traction in Scotland initially before spreading elsewhere. it obviously, as you know, wasn't this straightforward, and the development of Presbyterianism from the 16th century and through the 18th century was, quite frankly, rather bloody. But I'm sure most of you are familiar with this history. For our purposes, though, this is why the State Church of Scotland, the Church of Scotland, is Presbyterian, but the Church of England is Episcopalian in government. So this unease over state interference with church affairs continued until the disruption of 1843, where a third of the Church of Scotland ministers resigned and formed the Free Church of Scotland. Free, of course, from state interference and influence, and free to elect and appoint their own church leadership. But this story is, of course, only a small part of the Christian history of the area. For well over 1,000 years, Fife has been at the forefront of new religious trends in Scotland. Archaeological evidence suggests that the Pictish inhabitants of Fife were early adopters of Christianity from the 4th century on. And if I could still have the map up, if that wasn't too much of a stress on my internet connection, I would show you some of these. But you'll just have to come visit for the personal tour. From then, Fife was increasingly influenced by Christianity. By the 8th century, the religious Pictish settlement called Kinrymant was becoming well known in Scotland and overseas. Now, the legend has it that in the 4th century, a Greek bishop called Saint Regulus fled to Scotland with some bones belonging, at any rate, during the early Middle Ages, so by the 9th century, I think, the churchmen at Kinrymant had acquired several bones and a tooth, to which they believed were from Jesus' apostle, Andrew. Kinrymant became a holy place, it was renamed St. Andrew's in his honor, and became an important pilgrimage center. St. Andrews came to be regarded as the religious and ecclesial capital of Scotland and influential in the British Isles. St. Andrew's Cathedral, built from the 12th century, was the largest building ever constructed in medieval Scotland. During the 15th century, St. Andrews also became home to Scotland's first ever university, the St. Andrews University, which was intended to further divine and human learning among Scottish churchmen. St. Andrews was not only the only important religious center in medieval Fife. Major monasteries were built along the coast, in places such as Corris, Balmerino, and Lindorus. Again, I would show you these on the map. Fife isn't that big. If you Google it, you'll find it. Slightly inland, the vast Benedictine monastery at Dunfermline was for many years the burial place of Scottish kings and housed the shrine of Queen Margaret, who also was a proponent for Christianity in Scotland and was officially declared a saint in 1250. During the 16th century, Fife was at the heart of the religious rising which forced through Scotland's shift from Catholicism to Protestantism. In May of 1559, as I'm sure you all know, John Knox preached a fiery sermon at Holy Trinity Church in downtown St. Andrews, which sparked the sacking of the cathedral. The reformers tore down altars and images and started celebrating services according to the English Book of Common Prayer. Within 2 years, only 2 years, services were no longer held at the cathedral and it fell into ruin. At the start of the 1690s, the Scottish Parliament declared its support for a Presbyterian religious settlement. Many Fife residents welcomed the change, but a proportion of Episcopalians refused to conform to the new religious regime and set up their own breakaway congregations. And these provide the origin of the modern Scottish Episcopal Church. Then we fast forward a couple of hundred years. The 20th century saw some healing of the division between different groups of Protestants. There's also a notable growth in Roman Catholicism in Fife, partly because of migration from Ireland and continental Europe. New evangelical communities sprang up, sometimes worshiping in houses and halls rather than constructing traditional church buildings. Today, though, Fife is on the front line of complex debates about the future of Scotland's ecclesiastical heritage. A combination of declining congregations, a shortage of ministers, and problems in church finance, along with rising maintenance costs, mean that a large proportion of churches are likely to close their doors. As a region with an especially significant religious past, questions about the fate of former churches are particularly pertinent to Fife. The Church of Scotland, which is the denomination with the largest number of places of worship in the region, has plans for a fundamental reorganization of its congregations, which has triggered church closures on an unprecedented scale. I want to show just a few slides that highlight some of the trends in this region. So here we go. We'll try this.
Yeah, 93. That'd be great.
Here we go. So this just shows the number of places of worship founded in for the series. And see, there is a big influx in the on this side close still the same from a number of closing due of course to the Reformation. Then it remains somewhat stable. And then we just have this tremendous closure from the 1900s and onwards. 31, of course, the state and Dr. Bess Rhodes for her research, which has resulted in these numbers. Bess's research included analyzing the fates of 237 former churches in coastal Fife, which closed between 1500 and 2022. All right. I'm back again, I think. Okay, it looks like I probably won't share more things with you. Fife has experienced several phases of church closures. Especially the introduction of Protestantism in the 16th century saw numerous monastic sites and chapels cease to fulfill a religious function. More than half of the former churches in Fife were ultimately demolished or fell into ruins. Perhaps unsurprisingly, demolition or dereliction was particularly common in the earlier centuries. Of the churches in Fife, which closed before 1900, more than 80% ultimately experienced ruination or destruction. And in the 1600s, that was 90%. However, the demolition of former churches remained common even up to now, with over 40% of churches closing, ultimately being demolished. In the 19th century, the demands of congregations for larger buildings, especially in the heart of settlements in bigger cities, as people were moving from rural Scotland into the cities, saw many medieval and early modern sites abandoned or demolished. Changing attitudes to church attendance in the 20th century, combined with the reunification of the Church of Scotland and the United Free Church, drove the largest number of closures thus far. However, it gets worse. The governance structures within the Church of Scotland dictate that the ultimate decisions on the future of church buildings are taken by the denomination's regional presbyteries. These presbyteries were tasked by the governing body of the church, the General Assembly, to implement a rationalization process in 2019. The vast majority of these church buildings are, however, owned by the general trustees of the Church of Scotland and effectively leased by the congregations who own the contents within, but are responsible for the building's upkeep. So each presbytery was tasked with producing a plan that assessed each of its buildings according to the merits or faults categorized in the report, and on how each building directly benefited the church's desired 5 marks of mission. The often long histories and considerable cultural and social heritage of the buildings, the congregations, and the sites were not points of consideration in this process. In addition to asking its presbyteries to judge each of its buildings, the denomination also set about the massive reorganization of its presbytery structures at the same time, setting an ambitious target of completing all plans by the end of 2022. That's 3 years. So from 2019 to 2022. Some were submitted and agreed long before that date. Other plans are still not fully finalized and agreed today. That's 3 years overdue, if you're keeping track. This, as you might imagine, has led to a deep frustration across Scotland, with many local communities finding out far too late to make realistic and sustainable plans for the future of their beloved buildings that might have seen them transfer them into local community hands, something that will always take some considerable time and effort to organize. There are other particular issues. Churches themselves pose their own specific issues as redundant. They are typically of a size and degree of architectural significance that few village halls attain. Indeed, churches are often the largest and oldest buildings in a Scottish community. In this context, the Church of Scotland has a particularly onerous responsibility, as for historical reasons, it has inherited ownership of many of Fife's oldest religious buildings, a proportion of which even predate the introduction of Presbyterianism to Scotland. With Scotland being a largely secular country, many might shrug at the loss of religious institutions and practices for which they hold these closures as a sign of modernity or for development opportunities that they believe lie ahead. But we need to consider the negative impacts that these closures are having on the individuals, groups, and communities that regularly use these buildings in every village, town, and city. The roles that many churches play as sites of memory and commemoration also raise particular concerns, as well as war memorials, which have been relatively well documented through projects led by Historic Environment Scotland and the Imperial War Museums. Fife's churches house thousands of individual monuments, many of which still have meaning for local communities. If a church building ceases to be a public space, access to these memorials can be restricted or ended. A large proportion of Fife's churches are surrounded by graveyards. Indeed, most pre-Reformation places of worship and a small number of post-Reformation sites also saw burials within the church building. Local authorities have responsibility for the majority of Fife's graveyards, whether or not they are adjacent to an active place of worship. However, the siting of churches beside or at times directly above places where human remains are interred places restrictions on options for the development of many religious sites. It's very common in Fife as you're going around now to drive past something that looks like it was a church at one time, but it will now be a place of residence. And then right in your back garden is a graveyard, which you are not allowed to touch, of course. So these are significant ethical questions. Churches are not ordinary buildings. They are sites which communities put aside for the worship of God. Over the centuries, they have been places of faith, reflection, inspiration, and communal gathering. Even for people who infrequently attend religious services, churches are places of meaning. The closure of a church has an impact going beyond the core congregation. If mishandled, church closures may cause resentment among congregations and wider communities. Conversations with Fife residents indicates that the loss of church building can be seen as the withdrawal of that religious organization from the community. Our research into late 16th and early 17th century attitudes toward the events of the Scottish Reformation indicates that the destruction of churches was often deeply regretted. Even committed Presbyterians subsequently criticized the closure of useful religious spaces. Perhaps the most fundamental lesson of past experiences of church closure is that we are not just taking decisions for our own time. I think I better stop there. Thank you so much for your time.
Thank you, Sarah. And if we missed bits and pieces from that because of the Zoom feed, we look forward to reading it in the Presbyterian history papers when they come out. Before I introduce our next speaker, his topic and his t-shirt remind me that, I'm sorry to say this, but I forgot to give a land acknowledgement at the beginning of the day this morning. So I just want to take a moment to say that the Canadian Society of Presbyterian History here at Knox is humbled and grateful to be able to gather together on land which is traditional territory of the Huron-Wendat, Haudenosaunee, and Anishinaabeg nations, and the Mississaugas of the Credit First Nation. And I'm sorry, because anyways. Our third speaker in this panel is Brian Fraser. Brian Fraser did his doctoral work with Ramsey Cook at York University in the social gospel among Canadian Presbyterians, graduating in 1982. He lectured in Canadian Presbyterian history at Knox College from the late 70s until 1985, when he moved to Vancouver to be professor of history at the Vancouver School of Theology. Seems like a good title for them to have. And dean of St. Andrew's Hall, the Presbyterian college associated with VST. He left St. Andrews and VST in 2002 and started his own consulting and coaching company, Jazz Think, to provoke people to think in jazz about their organizations and the leadership that enabled them to flourish. In 2009, following a consulting process with Brentwood Presbyterian Church in Burnaby, BC, he accepted their invitation to minister with them half-time. He is still doing that. Brentwood has developed a special relationship with the jazz community in Vancouver and beyond. He is the author of 3 books on the Presbyterian Church in Canada, and I should say he is the author of The Official History of Knox College, where we are today. He also worked as a research assistant with John Moyer on Enduring Witness and with N. Keith Clifford on the resistance to church union in Canada, 1904 to 1939. I should also say that reading Brian's book, The Social Uplifters, actually inspired me to submit an overture to this past year's General Assembly. Just seeing all the ways that the church used to be involved in trying to make society better. My presbytery sent in a overture about trying to do something about the problems with sports betting content on television broadcasts. And because I thought, reading Brian's book, I thought this is something that these people would be caring about today. Thank you, Brian. And
thank you, Robert. Let's see, remove spotlight. Everybody can hear me okay? All right, thank you. So the title that I've given this, the shifting title that I've given this paper is a prolegomena to a paper, a potpourri of ponderings and provocations. The focus of this potpourri is how among our colleagues in the Presbyterian Church in Canada, historical and contemporary, we have misrepresented Jesus in our relations with our Indigenous kin in Canada. It's appropriate that we're meeting on the weekend of the Truth and Reconciliation Day. This is a question that has haunted me, and I use the word intentionally since the first reading of this phrase in section 4 of our confession of 1994. We have misrepresented Jesus Christ. The sentence within which the phrase occurs reads as follows. In our cultural arrogance, we have been blind to the ways in which our own understanding of the gospel has been culturally conditioned. And because of our insensitivity to Aboriginal cultures, we have demanded more of the Aboriginal people than the gospel requires, and have thus misrepresented Jesus Christ, who loves all people with a compassionate, suffering love that all may come to God through him. For the church's presumption, we ask forgiveness. Now, how exactly have we misrepresented Jesus Christ? What representations did we make to our indigenous kin? What culturally conditioned interpretations of the scriptures witness to the living word of God in Jesus Christ were being taught and propagated in and through our residential schools? How do we find out more about this so that we can reformulate what arose and still arises from our insensitivity and our cultural arrogance? This is not an ordinary history paper. If I handed in this potpourri of ponderings and provocations to Stuart MacDonald, I'd be summoned to his office for further conversations. Either that or just totally dismissed. But if I got into the office, the summons would be right and proper. So please consider these initial notes that would arise from that conversation. I'll begin with the period of our history as a denomination that I know best. That's the period from the 1880s to the 1920s. What's most significant about this period for our purposes is its cultural arrogance. Our forebears in our denominational heritage were convinced that their appropriation interpretation of the gospel was the best the world had to offer. Now, that arrogance was rooted in a philosophical and theological worldview shaped by a movement called British idealism. T.H. Green in England, John and Edward Caird in Scotland. By the 1890s, the philosophy departments in most, if not every, Canadian university was staffed by British idealists. The most prominent proponent of that school was John Watson, who was at Queen's, taught there from 1872 to 1924. And British idealism is a mix of Hegelian evolutionary world synthesis. That's the way history is unfolding. And Kantian ethical imperatives. This is the way you must act, should act. Most Canadian universities followed the Scottish model of higher education. Mental philosophy, how you see the world, was in the third year, shaped how you thought. And moral philosophy was taught in the fourth year and operated as kind of an integrating discipline as to how you should act as influential cultural leaders in the society, because that's the people who went to university. Whether your career took you into education or law or the church, you were bearing the cultural imperialism of British idealism. In theology in Canada, the leading representative of this movement was Thomas B. Kilpatrick, professor of theology at Knox College. Both Watson in an earlier generation and Kilpatrick in his were students of Edward and John Caird in Glasgow and seen by Edward Caird as the two finest minds who had ever passed through his classrooms. The summary of their worldview is that each of the major civilizations that flowed together into Western culture contributed a moral imperative to the evolution of humankind. Now, the interesting thing in the way that Canadian Christians, especially the social gospelers among Canadians of all denominations, one of the ways they thought about it was, look, Europe is too old to change. America is too lawless to change. The changes that we envisage, the Christianization of civilization, that's the language they use, that we envisage, is most likely to happen in Canada. So it was kind of, in some ways, American Manifest Destiny on steroids. And there's a good window into it, found in Kilpatrick's little book called Christian Character, A Study in New Testament Morality. It came out in Scotland in 1899 and then was republished in 1904. Its original publication was part of a series of Bible class primers that was edited by Principal Salmon of Free Church College, Aberdeen. Now, haven't had the opportunity to, it's been a while since I wrote The Social Uplifters. So I haven't had an opportunity to reread Kilpatrick's book. But I think it, with the kinds of questions in mind that we're talking about, but I think it might be a good place to start for that generation. And Jesus is represented as a moral teacher, an example, a standard, and a redeemer. So this is what I called in the, both in the Social Uplifters and the History of Knox, evangelical liberalism. It doesn't fit the categories of liberalism that we're familiar with from the US, because it retains a significant component of traditional Christian understanding of Jesus as Savior. Now, I would suggest that the influence of this cultural framework really lasted in Canada through the Pearson years. It was the founding theology of the United Church of Canada. Things were evolving into greater and greater unity around moral imperatives. That unity looked very white, very Anglo-Saxon, and very Protestant. There's a bit of poetic doggerel. It's satiric in some ways, but there's other ways in which it kind of captures the arrogance of that worldview. This was a poem that one of the speakers at the Social Service Congress in Ottawa in 1914 found in the Cleveland Plain Dealer. It's the poem from which I took the title of the book on the social gospel. The title of the poem is The Ignorant Masses. The social uplifters, those eminent sifters of merit and poor people's needs, went down to the slums to regenerate bums and do meritorious deeds. We washed them, we dressed them, with libraries blessed them, we prayed for those ignorant mobs. The wretches were hateful and vilely ungrateful and said what they wanted was jobs. Our noble committee then searched through the city to find all the fallen and lost. We learned how they came to be living in shame, this, mind you, at no little cost. We swamped them with tracts and statistical facts, but the creatures were terribly rude. They acknowledged 'twas nice to be freed from all vice, but said what they wanted was food. They're just as God made them. It's useless to aid them. The brutes do not ask for reform. Intellectual feasts are all wasted on beasts who want to be fed and kept warm. Let them keep their allotted positions, besotted and blind when you bid them advance. These ignorant asses, the underworld masses, will say all they want is a chance. Well, it's pretty gross. But I think it does capture, again, in an extreme satirical way, that component of middle-class white Anglo-Saxon Protestant cultural arrogance that would have informed the establishment and the operation of the residential schools during that period. And I haven't had an opportunity to explore how this worldview got expressed. So these are kind of the ponderings and the questions. How that got represented in Sunday school material. How was Jesus represented in the educational resources used in residential schools? What were those resources? Who was teaching them? How were those teachers formed in their cultural assumptions? Now, I've mentioned the Scottish series of Bible class primers. Another intriguing source to explore might be the International Sunday School Lessons. It was a movement founded in 1872, a lot of ecumenical cooperation between denominations that we would now see as more divided than people saw then. In a 1905 report, the movement claimed to be reaching 17 million teachers and students on every continent.
Oh, you've gone back to the Presbyterian history.
I'm sorry? Oh, okay. So in Canada, a guy by the name of George Pidgeon, who was minister at Bloor Street Presbyterian, later United Church in Toronto, Pidgeon was one of the major proponents of the social gospel. He started to write a weekly column on the lessons in the Globe. So he wrote a weekly column on the International Sunday School lesson for that week in the Toronto Globe. The Globe was, at that point, the most widely circulated newspaper in Canada. It was edited by the Reverend James A. MacDonald, a close colleague of Pidgeon's in the promotion of progressive evangelicalism. And MacDonald was also a member of Pidgeon's church. He actually lived a couple of blocks away from it on Bloor Street. MacDonald edited the Toronto Globe from 1903 to 1915. Again, on that pulpit, with that platform, had a significant influence across Canada. Now, I don't know of anybody who's looked at those columns to assess how they represented Jesus, nor do we know the influence that they may have had on teaching in the residential schools. I've done a little bit of poking around and asking. Nobody seems to remember what the religious curriculum was for religious, what the curriculum was for religious education in the residential schools. That may be in the papers. I haven't had a chance to look, but some of the major histories of residential schools really don't touch on that topic at all. So I think it's an avenue worth pursuing to determine more precisely the shape of our cultural arrogance and our representations of Jesus, especially in those first decades of the cultural colonialism that happened through residential schools. So that's that period through until really the First World War. My own argument is that the First World War literally blew that worldview to pieces on the battlefields in Europe. Took a long time to die, but that was the initial shock. Their kind of progressive view of how history was evolving, something like the First World War simply wasn't supposed to happen, and it took them a long time to figure out how to process that. So a significant dimension of this proposed exploration after church union would be shaped by the realities documented by Alan Ferris in The Fathers of 1925 and Keith Clifford in The Resistance to Church Union in Canada. Alan identified and Keith kind of expanded on the different strands of resistance to the movement for greater ecclesiastical unity in Canada. And for the church unionists, it fit into this, things are getting more and more united and better and better and better. Alan's categories were there were the anti-unionists, there were the federalists, there were the ethical critics, and there were the theological objectors. Papers called The Fathers of 1925. It really is a very good read. Most prominent among the latter resistors, the theological objectors, was Walter W. Bryden. I would argue the most influential thinker of the post-25 continuing Presbyterians. And John Vissers has done a wonderful kind of theological study and biography of Bryden. Bryden had an interesting influence on Sunday school curriculum, though. And it was through a guy by the name of James D. Smart. And the development of the Christian faith and life curriculum among American Presbyterians. He was there from 1944 to 1950, that's 6 years of working on that curriculum. And then when he returned to Canada, he was editor-in-chief for curriculum publications for our denomination from 1950 to 57. Then he went down to Union Seminary to teach Old Testament. Now, again, I don't know of any research done on the use and influence of Smart's curriculum in Canada, or on the representations of Jesus in that curriculum. There are a bunch of resources available that one could read to get a sense of that. And then the other open question is whether that curriculum was used in any of the residential schools at all. I grew up in Niagara Falls, Drummond Hill Presbyterian Church in Niagara Falls. Bill McEwen was the minister there, very close friend of Alan Ferris. We used David C. Cook Sunday school material, primarily because of the comic book that came along with it. And so, again, I don't know the materials that were used in the residential schools, but I think it would be an interesting, an illuminating and revealing study. Now, as I mentioned, I've begun to ask around a little bit, haven't gotten a clear idea of how Jesus was presented or represented in the lives of residential school students and teachers. An interesting response came from Carmen Lansdowne, a friend out here in Vancouver, immediate past moderator of the United Church of Canada, soon to be faculty at Emmanuel College in Toronto. So kudos to Toronto School of Theology for bringing Carmen onto faculty. She said that her parents remember that much of the religious education they got came from the sermons of Thomas Crosby. And Crosby was a leading Methodist missionary on the BC coast from 1863 to 1907. And what happened was that people within the congregations that her parents were part of, and also in the residential schools that her parents went to, in a worship service, would read Thomas Crosby's sermons. That was the curriculum for their religious education. I haven't read Thomas Crosby's sermons, so I don't know the represent, but it's an interesting dynamic to explore. Most of the most frequent response I've gotten from the maybe 10, 15 people I've asked about this is, I never thought of the question. So I'm hoping that we can begin to think more about that question. I'm curious about what you think in the question period, and if you're welcome to get a hold of me and throw some ideas at me and some more further questions as we continue to think about this potpourri of ponderings and provocations. And I want to thank you for indulging my curiosity and concern. Good to be with you.
Thank you, Brian. And I should say that if you'd submitted that to my course at VST this year, I actually think you would have done fairly well.
Oh, yes. I was delighted to see that you were teaching there last year. That was great.
Thank you. Because we're a little bit behind schedule, we're probably going to only have about 10 or 12 minutes of questions. But I'd like to open up the floor to anyone who has questions for our speakers.
So Sarah sends her regrets. She had to go because of her internet connection, but if anyone's interested in contacting her, she's given me her information.
Ian?
Feel free to stand up so you can hear me all right. Or I've got a question for Brian. First of all, I'm a big fan of the Social Uplifters. I purchased a copy of the Victoria College used book sale last year after this conference.
I love it.
Really enjoyed it. In the course of your research about the topic you presented on today, but also with the Social Uplifters and all that stuff, have you ever run across the name J.W. Macmillan, and who was a leading sociologist and Presbyterian minister of the early 20th century? And I'm not sure if he would fit into this category of British idealists. I ask because I have to give a presentation about him next month to a local community group in Ontario, where he was the minister at St. Andrews for 8 years at the turn of the 20th century. I didn't come across his name in the Social Uplifters, but he seems to fit that sort of social gospel-y kind of mold of that time.
Yeah, I have this So he was minister at what, St. Andrews King Street?
No, Lindsay, Ontario.
Oh, Lindsay. Okay. All right. Yeah.
And,
Which at that point would have been a significantly large congregation. I somewhere in the back, in the recesses of my mind, the name rings a bell. And I can't tell you any more about that, but I would imagine that he would fit into this model. I mean, the thing is that with that influence from, and it's fair to say that not only the philosophy departments in Canadian universities, but the theology departments in Canadian theological colleges were by and large staffed by people that shared this view. So I would hunch that the answer is yes. Did you know where he studied?
studied at, I believe, at Knox. And then he eventually was on the faculty at Victoria College as the chair of Christian sociology.
Oh, that's okay. Yeah. Just so so he would have been educated within this worldview.
A picture of him in Recollections and Reflections.
Ah, okay. I'll go look.
Ready for the next question, or?
We'll do Stuart and then you, John. So we'll
I have a question for Peter. Love the paper. Thank you very much. I got lost, though, as to what specifically seems to have been the issue. I think I know, but I'm not sure. So what was the issue that was driving this heresy trial? Was it the holiness movement and the understanding? And you say just a little bit more about that, Peter?
The debate, the division is between a progressive sanctification, that's the left hand, versus an instantaneous or holiness, which the session uses those words interchangeably. Instantaneous sanctification or holiness are interchangeable for them.
Okay, thank you.
They hold a progressive sanctification view, and that's the language they use consistently for their view.
Thank you.
And it's interesting that they root that clearly in the creeds and confessions. And the response from the other side is, but the creeds and confessions are but a subordinate standard. We're going to scripture.
Mm. And what's interesting to me is that even participating in revivalism, as so many Presbyterian congregations would have been at that time, you're starting to fudge a little bit on predestination already. Is that the line that's too far, though, that idea of instant sanctification?
Clearly, from what I've read, it's the sanctification debate. And it is the seeking of a second blessing.
Thank you.
John, you have a question?
Okay, John Vaudry, a question. Well, now I remember that Peter was there, and I had a question for him, but I'll ask my questions of Brian. I guess the thing is, we know that in the early 20th century, late 19th century, there was a lot of social gospel. I mean, I heard it until the 1960s or 70s in my church. But there also was a residuum of the older evangelicalism.
Yeah.
And so I find George Campbell Pidgeon sometimes a little difficult to figure out, because he definitely, I think, is conservative. Today he would be called very conservative, I think, by a lot of people in our churches. He was influenced by Donald McVicar. He talks about hearing Moody, and on and on. He's in that milieu, but at the same time, there is that progressive strain, that social uplifter aspect. But I guess what I'm wondering is, if we're talking about mission to Indigenous people, and would the message that was being given to Indigenous people really be any different from what was being given to people in other churches? In other words, was George Pidgeon misrepresenting Jesus in Bloor Street United if somebody he was supporting was misrepresenting Jesus off at a residential school? And the other thing, of course, is that it isn't maybe as simple as the white middle-class Protestants or whatever. There also were indigenous people who became believers and became ministers. I was reading in Peter Bush's article in Gifts and Graces, Volume 2, and he talks about John Mackay or Mackay, one of the first native ministers in the denomination. And under his ministry, there was a kind of mini revival.
Mhm.
So was he misrepresenting Jesus? You know, I'll leave it at that.
So I think it's a great question that needs to get mixed, needs to get integrated into this search if anybody decides to take it up. I'm probably not going to. I will continue to be interested though. So a couple of quick things, John. The interesting thing, and I mentioned very quickly that my read is that the evangelical liberalism of the Canadians, rooted in British idealism, doesn't fit into those binary categories that we normally use to talk about conservative and progressive Christianity in North America. So, for example, Kilpatrick, one of the leading British idealist thinkers, was one of the leading proponents of a movement called simultaneous evangelism. Simultaneous evangelism is the roots of the Billy Graham approach. You send people in, you prepare the ground, then you send the big speakers in, and you're preaching revival. Okay? And Kilpatrick was part of that. I mean, he wrote a little handbook on simultaneous evangelism, how to do it. He was involved in the simultaneous evangelism campaign up in the Kootenays in British Columbia. So that kind of division, I think, needs to be bracketed out while we figure out their representation. Your second question raises another very good question. What do those framers of the confession mean by misrepresentation? Mm-hmm. And it's not, in some ways, it's not really clear. It would be interesting to interview that committee if they had any real clarity about how those misrepresentations took place. Would I say from my theological perspective that people like Pidgeon was misrepresenting Jesus? Yes. But my theological perspective is shaped from the 60s on, when we had that significant critique of where liberal theology had taken us. So lots of good questions, and I don't have any answers.
I think we have time for one more question. Peter, I see you have your.
Since you're talking residential schools, I can't help myself. I'm sorry.
Of course you can.
I think that post 25, the discussion about Bertel versus CJ are completely different conversations. CJ is a chaotic, confusing place with headmasters going through an extraordinary rate. At Bertel, Rousseau takes over in about 40 and is iron control for 30 years. My hunch is that at Bertel, it was a very pro forma kind of conversion experience. I know from people who were there, who went to confirmation, affirmation, like when people were confirmed, when Indigenous kids were confirmed, that basically they had been run through a class and were confirmed regardless of what they thought. And my hunch is that Rousseau did it, and that he did it with a curriculum built in the 30s and 40s, that he was not terribly creative or impacted by much of this. So I think those are two completely different conversations, those two schools. Pre-25, I think that's a much wider game. And I would also challenge the Peterization that you've got of 1880 to 1920. I think that there's a gap, there's a shift around 1905, 1908. I think that the teaching you've got is right, but I don't think it starts to really impact structures until around 1908, 1909, inside the PCC's thinking about mission. When at that point, home mission, Indigenous ministries becomes part of home mission. As long as Indigenous ministry remained part of foreign mission, I think it was a little more protected from Christianization as Canadianization.
That'd be an interesting question to explore. Thanks.
I think we will wrap things up here, but let's have another round of applause for our. Let's go back at 3:35 Ontario time. So it's shortening the break by.
Doing some dessert.